Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel, The Medieval Reader. So Steve Donahue is hosting a read-along of the Iliad in June, and I really want to read the Iliad in June. I'm not always the best at keeping up with read-alongs, but this is an epic that I've been putting off reading for ages. I've read the Odyssey a couple times, but I've never read the Iliad, so I really would like to do this in June. And then I believe it's in August when Steve is also hosting a read-along of the Odyssey, and I will be reading the Emily Wilson translation because it is the first translation of the Odyssey made by a woman, and I follow her on Twitter, and she's the professor at Penn, so I'm really excited to get through that as well. Today, we were supposed to have read the first 6 books of the Iliad, but I haven't read any of the books yet. I actually just read the introduction to get some background about Homer. What do we know about Homer? Not much, not anything actually. What do we know about the period in which Homer was living? What do we know about Troy, etc. So I wanted to kind of just share with you what I have learned from the introduction. The translation that I will be reading from is Barry B. Powell's translation of the Iliad, published by Oxford University Press in 2013. So we know that Homer is the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, but for many centuries Homer was attributed to a number of other Greek poems, but not anymore. The Iliad was written around the 8th century in what's known as the Iron Age. But Troy, for the longest time there was no evidence that there was a Trojan War, but most recently, there have been some evidence about a place called Hisarlik, which may have been Homer's Troy. It was destroyed around 1190 BCE. So as you can tell, a few hundred years went by before the Iliad was written. So there is going to be a lot of legends, and of course, histories weren't done the way that they are done today. I've kind of talked about this on my channel. So whether or not there really was a Trojan War is really not that important. But what is important is that Homer is writing in the Iron Age about something that most likely occurred in the Bronze Age. So that's before the Iron Age. The way that we have received the Iliad is also really interesting, because the original isn't really written in words. Like, there isn't really grammar. There are these letters that are strung together to express the sound. There wasn't really any kind of written culture in the way that we think about it today. And Homer was most likely illiterate, and then he had scribes who were transcribing what Homer said using sounds. So when you read it, if you were to read it in the original, which I don't think we have anymore, it would have reflected the sound rather than, the grammar or concrete words, in the way that, we think about English as you have a number of words that are strung together in a certain way, and that is how Greek is taught too in classics programs, but that's not how the Iliad or the Odyssey was written. And so that's really important. The version that translators use today is based off of an Alexandrian version. So in the 4th century BCE, you have Alexander the Great, and one of Alexander the Great's generals and his descendants essentially were the Ptolemies. And the Ptolemies, they collected thousands of texts, and they then edited them and created these Greek editions. And so the version the translators use is this Alexandrian edition, modified, edited by the Ptolemies. And the version that the Alexandrians were using is known as the Vulgate, or the Koine edition, Koine being this everyday Greek. So as you can see, it's not as simple as saying, oh, this is a faithful translation to the original, because the versions, the Greek editions of the Iliad we have today, nobody in Homer's day would have been able to recognize it. They would not have been able to read it. Even the scribes who were literate, they would not have been able to read it, because reuse words and sentences and grammar, that's in all of the Greek editions that are used for translation purposes, but the original wasn't like that. So, just something to keep in mind when you're reading these translations, that, asking them to be quote-unquote faithful to the original is misguided, essentially. So Powell talks about how he's not attempting to be elegant or to use archaic expressions or anything like that, because actually the Greek that's used is very everyday Greek. It's very plain, so he tries to use plain speech. He feels like the epithets really add the color to the text, and so he does want to emphasize the epithets, but he's not really going to try to make it elegant, because again, that's missing the point. This poem was delivered orally, and so as soon as you're reading it, you're already missing something. So what is important is the rhythm of the text. So on page 19, there's this quote: "The text is not the song, but the symbolic representation of the phonetic aspect of the song." There were evidently these wild lines in the version that the Alexandrians edited, this Vulgate version. They removed the wild lines to keep the same number of lines per stanza. But really the emphasis has to be on the rhythm, which is in dactylic hexameter. That is the rhythm of the poem. The first line talks about Achilles' wrath, and the theme of anger is huge. It's a major theme in the poem. It's about anger and the consequences of anger. There's also discussions about fate and the gods, how the gods determine fate. Fate is something that humans cannot manipulate in any way. They are always subject to their fate. And what is interesting is, the gods are like the humans, but unlike the humans, the gods can't die. So whatever the gods do is always somewhat humorous, because nothing's ever really that serious. But when Achilles does something, it is very serious. It has consequences, because Achilles, unlike the gods, is mortal. Thus, the question of justice is also interesting. There can't really be a concept of justice from the divine perspective, but of course from the human perspective, there is this question of justice, and also of honor. There's this need to maintain honor, and Achilles is constantly trying to uphold his own honor, and I think there's also Agamemnon, who's concerned about honor. So that's really what I have for you about the Iliad. It was a really great introduction. And I think, again, it's just a reminder that word by word translations are not necessarily better, especially when you don't really have words in the original version. So really, it seems that reading multiple translations of the Iliad would be the best idea. And of course, translators always make choices. So, it's important to read the translator's preface and to see why, what the translator is intending, or what they're thinking about when Powell talks about how he's not going to emphasize style, he's more concerned about the rhythm, or that he will sometimes repeat a name instead of inserting a pronoun, because pronouns can be ambiguous in the Greek version that he's using. That was really, really important, but I'm not really going to stress about the style, again, because it's not important. I hope some of this stuff was interesting to you. I mean, I was really fascinated with how this Greek had no punctuation, no spacing between words, or between the sound, the phonemes, I guess they would be called in linguistics today, which is a cluster of sounds that have some significance. I thought that was all really, really interesting. And I will be making a video probably Wednesday or so covering the first 6 books of the Iliad. But until then, I hope you guys have a great week, and I will talk to you later. Bye now.